Okay, you can start.
Okay, I'm gonna give it a minute. I just see attendees sort of trickling in. And so as soon as a couple more are visible, we can get started.
And Karen, will you mute everyone?
I think they'll be automatically muted. Yep. Okay, welcome everybody. I am Ruth Bronstein. I'm currently the president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, and I am thrilled to be here for a webinar that is going to be focused on the topic from Francis to Leo XIV, looking into a post, quote, "Who am I to judge Catholic Church in the wake of the announcement of the new Pope?" And this webinar will feature three of our members who are, prominent leading experts on the Catholic Church. And we're especially excited to feature the recipient of the 2024 Student Paper Award, Father Lucas Sharma. And he will be in conversation with Tricia Bruce and Tia Noelle Pratt. And our conversation today will be moderated by another one of our members and a council member, Ariella Kesar. So thank you so much to everybody who is here to learn more about this important topic, and to all the members of our webinar for sharing your expertise and your time with us today. Just a quick note that we are recording the webinar, and so it will be available on our website and on YouTube afterward. If people were not able to make it, you are welcome to share that with them, and just to be aware that questions and conversation will be recorded today. So with that, I'll turn things over to Ariella. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure that you can join us during your summer break. As you heard, I'm Ariella Kesar, and we thought of organizing webinars to honor the winners. Today, we're starting with a student award. We're going to honor the winner of the book award and also the distinguished article award. These will have more webinars coming in the fall, even before the annual meeting. Because this is a timely topic, we decided to begin with the 2024 Student Award. It was an unpublished paper by Lucas Sharma, and the title was The Francis Effect, American Catholic Priests' Attitudes on Lay, Same-Sex Behavior, and Homosexual Clergy. And we are joined by two sociologists that will discuss the legacy of Pope Francis and kind of the emergent of papacy of Pope Leo XIV. So after Lucas Sharma, who is the PhD candidate from the Department of Sociology at UC San Diego, after his presentation, we'll hear from Dr. Tricia Bruce, who is the president of the Association for the Sociology of Religion. She's a Vatican consultant and is affiliated research scholar at the University of Southern California Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies. We are also going to join by Dr. Tia Noelle Pratt of Villanova University, Assistant Vice President and Director, Mission, Engagement, and Strategic Initiatives, Editor of Journal of Catholic Social Thought, Assistant Professor of Sociology. So please, you will be welcome to ask questions. Please post them on the chat. So we hope to have enough time for the Q&A at the end. And we're going to start with Lucas to share the screen, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Ariella and Ruth, for having me today, and for being willing, all of you, to join us for this presentation today. This paper, it's got a new title, given some adaptations I've made in the past couple of months. Today's title is Taking Francis's Pastoral Approach, Catholic Priests' Approval of Pope Francis and Attitudes Towards Lay Same-Sex Behavior and Homosexual Clergy. It's a little different than it was when I originally presented it at SSR in 2023. And when I thank the Society for the award in 2024. The paper has evolved because of really great feedback I've gotten from many of you members here today. Uh, so to give you a sense of what I hope to do today, I'd like to contextualize the late Pope Francis's pastoral perspective and focus particularly on the way he talks about homosexuality the way he talked about homosexuality in particular. Um, from there, I'd like to share findings from the paper, the updated version of the paper, which is under review with a journal at this time, but was, as I said, originally presented at the 2023 SSR in Salt Lake City. And then we'll hear responses from Dr. Bruce and Dr. Pratt and have a discussion. So with that, I'll begin our presentation. So, as you all know, Pope Francis was elected to lead the Catholic Church in 2013 following Pope Benedict the 16th's resignation, something that hadn't occurred in many centuries and marking similarly the first non-European pope in also centuries with Jorge Cardinal Bergoglio of Argentina. While we didn't exactly know what was going to happen, there was something different from the start. And we see this in particular in the way that he dealt with and journeyed with people who today we'd identify as LGBTQ+. The church's teaching, as many of you know, is that any sexual behavior outside of the context of a heterosexual marriage open to procreation is called, quote, intrinsically disordered, and so that applies to same-sex sexual behavior. Pope Francis's approach, in contrast to his two predecessors, has been to meet people where they're at. We saw this in July of 2013 when he said, "Who am I to judge?" about gay priests on an airplane. And later, in his own words, he says he expanded that to all gay and lesbian people. This was one from his book, The Name of God is Mercy. He says, "A person once asked me in a provocative manner if I approve of a gay person. I replied with another question. Tell me, when God looks at a gay person, does he endorse their existence with love or reject and condemn this person?" Pope Francis has extended this approach to the blessing of same-sex couples, not marriages. So there's a kind of a clear asterisk, but that's his way of meeting people where they're at without changing church teaching. And even before he was Pope, he has said that he supported same-sex civil unions by the government, not by the church itself, but by the government for legal protection. So this is his way of meeting people where they're at on the topic of same-sex relationships. The way I'd like to say this is that this is his way of providing a particularly pastoral approach, one that prioritizes meeting people rather than doctrine. And here's a quote from now Cardinal McElroy, Bishop of San Diego at the time, when he said this quote, but now Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, trying to describe what this pastoral approach might look like. He says, Pope Francis is showing us that pastoral outreach must proceed from Jesus and the way he approaches the people in the gospel. He embraced them with the love of God, heals them, and then asks them to reform their lives. The overarching pastoral framework that Francis is demonstrating himself and calling us to return to is embracing, healing, and then reforming and renewing. He embodies the principles of pastoral theology, the principle of gradualism. It is accompaniment of a person. This, I think, marked his approach, and we might hear more from our panelists after my own presentation. But I argue this marked his approach throughout his years as Pope. And I wondered, as I looked at the Survey of American Catholic Priest data, if we might see impacts on that on priests, on American Catholic priests. And this is the quote I just read for you. And so I asked the question directly: are there key ways to think about Pope Francis's impact on American Catholic priests' attitudes, particularly on the topic of homosexuality. We know from sociological literature since the 2000s, definitely, but a little bit before that, that priests' attitudes are increasingly conservative on topics of sexuality and particularly on homosexuality. And in one of the latest studies from 2020, 2021 by Vermeulen, Regnerus, and Craney, one of our authors of which is on our call today. So he may have some Q&A as well for us or corrections. They found from the survey of American Catholic priests that priests are who are more recently ordained rather than age, more religiously traditional as measured by practice of the Liturgy of the Hours, a prayer that priests are obligated to pray each day, more politically conservative and identify as heterosexual compared to a Kinsey range from heterosexual to purely homosexual and a category of missing. Heterosexual priests, they're more likely to be increasingly conservative on topics of sexuality and homosexuality in particular. I have here for a graph for you, just showing, for example, by ordination decade, a clear descriptive statistic showing that priests who are more recently ordained, as seen in the far right on the screen, are more likely to think that same-sex sexual behavior is always wrong. So just as one of the indicators from their survey. In light of that, I wanted to know, for the sake of the paper and the drafts that it's unfolded, what might predict priests' attitudes following up on the work of Vermeulen, Regnerus, and Craney, if there might be other ways to think about what predicts attitudes regarding sexuality, and what predicts what might be always considered sexual sin. And so I asked, at the time I called it a Francis effect, does approval of Pope Francis and his pastoral approach predict attitudes towards sexual behavior and in particular towards homosexual sex, and approval of whether gay men should be allowed to be priests? This data was collected by the Austin Institute in 2020, 2021, with two different sets of samples, generating a N of 1,036. And the authors in their published work note the kind of nuances in the way that they collected the sample, but note that this is the best available data we have, especially measuring sexual orientation, something that the literature has shown is hard to measure of Catholic priests for a variety of reasons. One of which that's a fraught topic to admit even anonymously or confidentially on a survey that one might not be fully heterosexual given the political climate in the United States and the Catholic Church. I asked the question, can we predict what predicts whether someone thinks that homosexual sex is always, often, sometimes, or never sinful? And I also checked this with four other dependent variables, the same question, or three other variables. Premarital sex is always sinful, masturbation is always sinful, and contraception is always sinful. So I ran the same analysis, but I'm focusing on the same-sex behavior for the sake of this presentation. And then I also asked the question, Pope Francis has been this pope who said, who am I to judge with regard to gay men who are trying to live their vocation as priests as best as they can? What might predict priests' attitudes around gay priests, or in the official language of the Catholic Church, men with deep-seated homosexual tendencies, something we've seen in the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops documents as late as 2022, so relatively recently. And the question asks, men with deep-seated homosexual tendencies should not be allowed to be priests, with strongly agree as the strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree as the responses. I ran a generalized ordered logistic regression for the sake of the presentation you're seeing today. That was not the model in the original SSR presentation, but it was in the paper award from 2024. I want to suggest from all the numbers you see on this slide that there's a distinctive Pope Francis effect for these two indicators, homosexual sex and gay priests. We see, as Vermeulen, Craney, and Regnerus did in their previous work, that indeed the same findings hold with the model I ran with the generalized ordered logistic regression, that priests who are more politically conservative, priests who are heterosexual as opposed to homosexual or missing in the sexual orientation indicator, priests who increasingly pray the Liturgy of the Hours of the Divine Office, and priests who are more recently ordained are more likely to think that homosexual sex is always sinful and that gay men or priests with men with deep-seated homosexual tendencies should not be allowed to be priests. However, what's unique in the paper that I presented and or won the award for, and what I'm offering today, is that there is something unique about approval of Pope Francis, that when adding the variable into the generalized logistic regression, which I'm willing to share at another time if you'd like the actual charts, that also is statistically significant and does not change the relationship or statistical significance of the other indicators that Vermeulen, Regnerus, and Craney found, suggesting that perhaps there's something unique about approval of Pope Francis, predicting how priests might understand these issues. Interestingly, I ran these models and I include them in the paper under review as supplemental online only resources or charts. Interestingly, this relationship does not hold for the topic of contraception, premarital sex, and masturbation. So while approval of Pope Francis accounts for something in the first two models, it doesn't in the other three, suggesting that there really is something distinctive about approving of Pope Francis, and I'm suggesting approving of his pastoral approach, in particular to the topic of meeting LGBTQ people where they're at, and his "who am I to judge" approach around priests who identify as gay or with same-sex sexual desire. That is different than the other indicators of sexual behavior, which, again, from a church teaching perspective, are all the same, are all, quote, intrinsically disordered behaviors, but there's something in particular, at least for the same-sex sexual behavior indicator. As I said, this is unique for the homosexual models, but not others. And so it causes, I think, us as sociologists to pause and reflect what might be causing this, especially in light of the framing of our panel today. We have a new Pope, Pope Leo XIV. We're still in new months to see what his papacy, how it will unfold. Francis was elected in April of 2013, and the "Who am I to judge" comment came in July of 2013. And a very important American media article that was also an Italian newspaper or Jesuit journal in Italy came out in September of 2013, and that was when he sort of laid out what we would see come out as his pastoral approach interview with Jesuit Antonio Spadaro. We are only in June, right, of a pope elected in May, right? It was last month? Yes, in May. And so it's what a blur. It's been just a few weeks. And so I will be curious as our panelists to see how we might see if this pastoral approach continues with Leo on this topic as opposed to others. The media has already presented him as inherently more conservative than Francis, a claim that I actually contest. Given the presentation I gave to you, I think that Francis, too, in his own way, was conservative on topics of sexuality, not changing the church teaching, but adding ways to meet people where they're at while maintaining the church teaching that these types of behaviors are intrinsically disordered. And we will see if Leo takes the same approach or something different. The one thing I'd like to note that's important about this data, and then I'll turn it to our panelists, that it's worth exploring in future studies. Vermeulen, Craney, Regnerus, and Craney did a really great study and provided us some of the best data we have on latest data on pre-sexual orientation, something I said that's fraught. And even with guaranteeing the anonymous nature of the findings, we still had 271 out of 1,036 skip the question of sexual orientation. And it's not because it's a sexual component. Everyone answered the masturbation question. So it wasn't because it's about sexuality, generally speaking. And so we might ask ourselves, as sociologists, continuing to try and grapple with these questions, priest attitudes in contrast to American lay attitudes, which are increasingly liberalizing on issues of LGBTQ inclusion in America and in the church. How do we better understand priest attitudes and especially in light of a new papacy. So I thank you again to the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, to Ruth and to Ariella for the award and for putting on this session today. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Bruce to continue our conversation today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lucas, Father Sharma. And I'm a big fan of Lucas's work, and am so thrilled that he continues to work on this general area and will continue to produce wonderful things for us to discuss and think about as we navigate the future of the church. Would encourage others to study Catholicism and the Catholic Church. There's such a richness there. So thanks to the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion for hosting this conversation and helping to support those scholars who are asking these kinds of questions. So I want to pick up on a couple pieces, a couple threads here as we think about this broader trajectory of the church and the transition in the papacy. And I want to think especially through this lens of priests and the priesthood, connected with issues of homosexuality and acceptance or attitudes therein. And I'm going to come at this from a couple different vantage points in particular. One is having led the qualitative component of a different study on priests that was out of the Catholic University of America, the Catholic Project, the National Study of Catholic Priests. And Lucas was actually one of the interviewers for that too, so he might have some additional things to add from that. But our team conducted 104 interviews with priests, face-to-face, one-on-one, throughout the U.S., drawn from a survey of over 10,000 priests that had the quantitative components from that too. But there's a richness there from those face-to-face conversations, so getting to hear and know priests in ways that surveys don't always disclose. So I'll be pulling from that. And then the other piece is I spent all of October in Rome at the Vatican as a consultor to the global synod process. I was appointed by Pope Francis as a consultor to the General Secretariat of the Synod. And so I was able to be there in person, not only with Pope Francis and all of the delegates, some 350 people from around the world, bishops and lay people and more, but also now Pope Leo. So he and I were in that space together. So really, of course, treasure that time and feel a deep sense of personal joy and connection and curiosity for what comes next. When I think about Pope Francis's entry into the papacy, as Lucas said, 2013, part of what I ask is what were the frames and what were the fears then, as a way to think through what are the frames and what are the fears now. 2013, if we can sort of go back to that moment, was still a time where the church was grappling with or even reeling with widespread revelations of abuse, which had a massive impact on the ways that priests saw themselves, the ways that bishops exercised their authority, questions around accountability, and questions around the Pope's role in that. And not only that, but there was a huge desire, of course, to reclaim trust amidst widespread skepticism. We know sociologically, too, that there's widespread skepticism and distrust among institutions more generally, religion certainly included, the Catholic Church certainly included. So part of what Francis stepped into was this deep desire to reclaim trust. And so priests within this, likewise, are facing fears, fears around allegations of abuse, questions around where does this come from? How do I, as a representative of the church, embody something and someone who is trustworthy? Crisis loomed large for the church at that time. And we could say arguably still today, but certainly in 2013, even though those revelations, of course, had been coming for some time and the abuse itself had been happening for decades. So it's not that it was new, but that frame was prominent. In the interviews that we did with priests, we asked about this question of crisis, sort of how do you define a crisis, and asked about the roots of the crisis. And the piece that I really want to pick up on here is that homosexuality emerges as a strong theme in the responses to these questions. So, for example, when you would ask about what is the crisis in the church today, then some priests, and I'll explain that some in a moment, would point to sin, and that sin more specifically is rooted in things like homosexuality. Other priests, of course, are going to be pointing to different kinds of challenges that the church and those in it have faced, things like clericalism and the like. I mentioned some. The differences are largely along the lines that we saw previewed in Lucas's paper from that different data set, which have to do with ideology and also generation and ordination year. So sometimes those overlap and sometimes those do not. But the shorthand version of this, as Lucas previewed already, is that younger priests who tended to be ordained later are self-identify as more conservative, and those conservative priests are more likely to pinpoint the roots of the abuse crisis in something like homosexuality. So for example, one said directly, a lot of this is rooted in homosexuality. Conservative-leaning priests more likely to identify homosexuality as being at the root of it because it incites secrecy, hiding, lack of oversight or removal, and unchecked networks in seminaries among priests and among leadership. I have my cat joining me for the webinar today as well. Formation is often seen as insufficient to resolve the issue because men should be vetted for psychological issues. So there's a particular definition of sexuality embedded in that. This is in contrast with priests who identify more progressively, who would say things like the lack of actually dealing with humanity. I think that's a big piece of it. To say it's a gay thing is ridiculous to me. So here priests would talk about, yes, people are sinners, but they're also sexual beings, and priests don't always learn who they are, nor find support in dealing with it. And so it's that disconnect, particularly as it arose in seminaries decades ago, that helped to explain the abuse crisis. So priests then respond to this differently, even in the ways that they dress. So you have older priests, for example, baffled by younger priests who are showing up to the bishop's barbecue in a full cassock. And meanwhile, those younger priests are saying, this is my way of reclaiming trust for the church, someone who is trustworthy, who has a new face for the church in light of abuse. Bishops, of course, make a big difference in the experiences of priests within their diocese. Most priests, though, and Lucas also hinted at this, are not in a position to be able to disclose openly their own orientation, particularly if they identify within that LGBT community. We interviewed one priest who was openly, publicly out. And it's a wrenching interview, the ways that he talks about the burden and the consequence of that out identity, and how difficult it has been to navigate that, and how much that has shaped also his empathy and compassion for others within that community. Francis, of course, opens up the space and the doors for listening, really. Synodality is a big kind of messy and confusing word that really means listening in many ways. And so it sparked he sparked a global multi-level consultation process in order to invite conversation among different voices, and voices that are often marginalized and not heard. Given that it's building upon this perceived higher level of openness to homosexuality and the LGBT community, then it created spaces for that to happen too. When I was over at the Synod in October this last year, there was one day actually where, despite Pope Francis having been literally, we had really long days. We had the congregational general meetings for several hours in the morning, several hours in the evening. In addition, there were other events and things in between. Through all that, there was a day that Pope Francis actually met with a group of transgender Americans and a doctor and some others from the LGBT community. And this was connected to some of the work that had been conversations that were being hosted by groups like New Ways Ministry and Outreach and other groups who were there also at the synodal, in the synodal process. So he was there. And that evening, I was able to meet with some of the folks who met with him during those conversations. And there was a sense of course, this sort of continual frustration, but also this joy of being heard and included and listened to by this man who is in this, of course, very public, visible space. Um, moving along a little, knowing that we're anticipating what is next. Of course, Robert Prevost is in all of these conversations. He actually shared the table with Father Jim Martin, who is someone who is very vocal, with whom I got to have many very animated conversations while in Rome and through the years, and someone who has really continued to raise this issue too and make sure that we think about it. The Synod documents, the final document, did not include explicitly, it did not name LGBTQ folks or the issue specifically or the community or sense of welcome. And some have critiqued that as a miss, as a fail. Others have said that the tool itself is one that invites a higher level of welcome. Robert Prevost, now Pope Leo, mentioned synodality as soon as he got out there. He already is sort of inviting and carrying on what could be called then this listening or more pastoral approach. He is also a canon lawyer. And he's also forwarded things like unity and peace and a desire for listening and for inclusion in various forms. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like. Right now, we're in this sort of honeymoon period. Priests and lay Catholics alike have, in recent years, said things like being a Pope Francis person or a Pope Benedict person. Pope Leo, now everyone I think is claiming him and hopeful. And so I find this a moment of deep curiosity and possibility for perhaps an interruption to some of the fractures that we've seen in the past. We know, though, that the church looks pretty different than U.S. Catholics, which is the last thing I'll just touch upon. Some of the latest data from Pew speaks into attitudes around homosexuality and same-sex marriage. And I was really intrigued. I'd love to actually talk more to the Pew folks about this too, that Catholics are about the highest among all Christians and the highest and some of the highest among all groups for acceptance of homosexuality. So some 74% of US Catholics say that homosexuality should be accepted. So there is, in many ways, this sort of trajectory that looks pretty different when you compare U.S. Catholics overall and priests, especially younger priests, in the context and climate and reasons that they are looking to, motivating them, and a broader zeitgeist of inclusion and acceptance. And so I think that Leo is well aware of this as an American and as someone from the United States specifically who will be thinking about this tension, mindful of this tension. He's already beginning to, I think, speak into some of those tensions, but it's yet to see what will happen. My last pitch is to invite all of you to a special forum on the future of Catholicism that will be hosted by the Association for the Sociology of Religion, as well as the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies of USC this August 9 to 11 in Chicago. Would love to continue that conversation with you all there in person. Thank you very much. And thanks and congratulations to Lucas, especially. I will turn it next to Tia, Dr. Pratt.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this wonderful conversation today. And congratulations to Father Sharma. Congratulations, Lucas. And so, I am hoping today to pick up on a different kind of thread from Lucas's talk, and especially in concert with the framing of our conversation today, and really on the pastoral piece and the sociologically significance of the pastoral piece of Pope Francis's pontificate, and what we've already seen in these first few weeks of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate. This approach from Francis was sociologically significant for the reasons that Lucas gave us, talking about meeting people where they're at. And in meeting people where they're at, it from the very beginning and throughout his papacy, it made me think about the ways in which this was a very Jesuit way of looking at things. This was about finding God in all things. This was about cura personalis, the care for the whole person. But he was able to do that without a shift in doctrine, without a shift in church teachings, and in ways of letting people who not only felt excluded but were excluded, uh, in a very formal way, that there is a place for them in this church. And then from that, we see, Father Jim Martin's ministry, outreach. We see the work of Father Brian Massengale, who's a theologian at Fordham University, and the way that he has begun to incorporate LGBTQ issues into his work that was already grounded in systemic racism. I like to say Father Massengale literally wrote a book on racial justice in the Catholic Church, because that is the name of his 2010 book from Orbis. So this pastoral approach was significant, not just in how Catholic faithful, both active and inactive, began to see him and began to see the church, but it was also significant sociologically in terms of how we see the church as an organization, in terms of how we see this structure, which is significant for our conversation today, especially as we talk about the pastoral work and the pastoral approach of Pope Francis. So, but then it goes beyond that, and we see Francis's work and the pastoral approach in terms of his visits to prisons, his outreach to the homeless, and even making space within Vatican City available to those who were unhoused in Rome. I mean, that was a humongous deal to see that, and to see the Holy Father be, as Francis said, a church that is poor and with the poor, and his call to priests to smell like the sheep, a metaphor that to be close with the people that you are serving. And organizationally, that is something that many hadn't seen before, to see, not just a parish priest, but to see the Holy Father himself, to call for that level of connectedness and closeness with not just people, but with those that are marginalized and disenfranchised among us. So some of the most vulnerable folks among us. So, and from there, we look back on this, and we think that it maybe was a surprise as Francis' papacy unfolded, but it really wasn't. Because from the first moment, he told us that this was going to be different, just with the name he chose, Francis. He chose a name that had never been used before. And so from that, he told the world, from those first moments in March of 2013, that his was going to be a papacy that was different. And even in that different papacy, we saw that kind of negotiation of the tension between wanting to be more inclusive and to give folks who hadn't had space within the church to feel that there was space there for them, but without then sacrificing orthodoxy, without them trying to change or needing to change the teachings of the church. Okay. So, so we have 12 years of Pope Francis, and the care for the earth as well, and the work of Laudato Si. And so what Francis tells us in Laudato Si, and how that has allowed for a broader conversation within the church and within society globally about the care for the earth, and how that impacts the most vulnerable among us. So, before Francis's papacy, we didn't hear about climate refugees. We didn't hear about, even though such folks existed. But now we have language for that. Now we have a pastoral approach to that, as well as seeking a more governmental and structural approach as well. Okay, so now we are in a new papacy of Leo the 14th. And again, with the name, we know a lot. The just from those first few moments. So in choosing the name Leo, Pope Leo the 14th, harkens back and reaches back to Leo the 13th, the founder of modern Catholic social teaching. And so he's told us that this is going to be something that he's going to focus on. And we've seen that just in these first few weeks in his public comments. That those first comments from the balcony, that initial Urbi et Orbi speech. He tells us, I am a son of St. Augustine. And that tells us that the Augustinian values of interiority, of community, of searching for truth, and are going to be a focus of his papacy. That we're and if and just as when Francis was elected, it was beholden on all of us to know where his Jesuit values were coming through. It is now beholden on all of us again to see this in Pope Leo. And we've seen it in these early days. We've seen it in the emphasis on community, on dialogue, on searching, on the interiority of Augustinian charism is about the restless heart of St. Augustine. So we've seen that call and that restlessness and that restless heart, even in these first few weeks, and in the call for dialogue, in using the Holy See as a place, which is not new, but it's also as we've seen, especially in these early days, a very Augustinian thing to do, to use the Holy See as a place where opposing sides can come and dialogue and be in community together and begin to work on the issues that plague not only the church, but more broadly the world. So as we continue to see this, we should look for the ways in which Catholic social teaching is manifested in what Leo says and does, and how Augustinian charism, community, interiority, searching for truth, service to the church, which is indeed service to the world, because this is someone who is not just regionally based. I mean, he was a prior general and therefore leader of the order for 12 years. He traveled the world in that capacity. And that's why so many of the Augustinians know him personally, because of that travel, because of that work, which is something Francis didn't have. Francis didn't have leadership role in the global Jesuit order in the way that Leo had in the global Augustinian order. So in that respect, we have now a pope that is not just a man of the country he was born and the country where he spent many years of his ministry and holds citizenship, namely the United States and Peru, but he is very much a man of the world. And we should look to how that is going to be seen and manifested in his papacy, in what he continues to share and do, and how that impacts the church, not just as a religious body, but as an organization, as a global, as a small c Catholic universal global organization. And so I'll pause there, and then I look forward to some further discussion.
Thank you so much. This has been very, very interesting. I learned a lot. And I am asking everyone to write some questions if you have on the post them in the chat. I don't know. I don't see any hands since we have almost 30 people online. It would be the easiest to for you to post. May I ask, since until we're waiting for people to write their questions, I'm curious about another topic, which I guess we can look at it, look at backward, looking forward. Um, do you see any possible changes with regard to the roles of women in the Catholic Church's leadership and any chance of changes looking forward? We have three speakers. Please, who would like to start talking about it?
I can jump in unless you'd like to. Tricia, it looks like you
Please.
wanted to jump in. So why
Go
don't
for
you
it.
jump in? I've got a different question for Tia and for you. So why don't you jump in?
I'll just say briefly, and maybe to connect it to the conversations that we're having already too, with regard to homosexuality and perceived acceptance or responses to that community, which is in many ways Pope Francis's approach was almost accidental and unpredictable in a way that was fun and also a little bit, I think, disarming and uncomfortable for some. So, like, it was not only the airplane thing, but there were comments too about women. I mean, he went on, I can't remember which, like, Dateline or something like that, and said, like, oh, women deacons are off the table. Whereas before it seemed like, there's a lot of sort of off the cuff. And my sense of Pope Leo is that there's a level of thoughtfulness, which is not to paint a contrast as if Francis wasn't thoughtful, but especially now in this role, my guess is he's going to be thinking very carefully about that. And he's also a canon lawyer, which some have mentioned too about the codification piece. So where my questions go in response to your question will be, how do these emergent roles that have come out of, for example, the Synod document, which does emphasize expanded roles for women, how does that get codified and practiced? And Leo is someone who is extremely attentive to regional differences and cultural contexts, and so might be someone to empower regions and bishops to make decisions that would empower women in ways that they've not seen as much before, responsive to needs. But I don't necessarily see that as being a universal. So we'll see. There will be thought to it, though, I'm sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody, Tia, would you like to weigh in?
Well, I'll just briefly say that Pope Leo XIV is indeed a thoughtful person who uh, takes these kinds of matters in a way that is uh, thoughtful and deliberative, and this is what we will hear from him is not something that will be an off the cuff, again, not to create this distinction in a way, but just to highlight what we can expect to see in the coming weeks and months and years. And so as Tricia mentioned, the codification of some of the things that we saw from Francis is something that I look to with great interest, and to see how that expands in the coming as I said, weeks and months.
Yeah.
I would just jump in and to build on Tricia and Tia. Tricia, I really like your your description of the off the cuff as kind of fun. I think that we didn't really know all the time what to expect, especially with that initial airplane ride that shocked the world. We got a question from Emily Burke in the chat, which I think it kind of builds on this question in particular. How do panelists see Leo navigating the tension between inclusion and orthodoxy, and bringing people in with and without changing the church teaching, similar or different? And to maybe my answer to Ariela's question would be, I think the approach we're going to see similar, given what you said, Tricia, is a continuity of synodality, a continuity of in forming the synod on the family, the synod on the Amazon, and the synod on synodality over his papacy. Francis set a tone that the church would be trying to listen more explicitly to people around the world on the ground and to let that bubble up. And it strikes me that Leo is going to continue that process, probably partly Tia, building on what you said around his experience in global leadership. The Augustinians are a lot smaller as an order than the Jesuits, and so I think there's been an ability to listen more deeply to the entire order in a way that our leadership can't do our leadership has to do in relation to a larger group, but but Leo has the experience of being able to travel around the world and really know his order. Perhaps he'll bring that in the way that he leads. My question, I guess, building on that comment on synodality and building maybe on Tia, your comment that to understand Francis, we needed to understand his spirituality as a Jesuit, and then you gave us some insights about the Augustinian friars. I'm curious for both of you if you have thoughts on when I think of Jesuit spirituality in particular, I think of Ignatian spirituality, I think of looking into the hearts of each of us to find where God is working in our deepest desires. And that maybe is part of the reason that Francis wanted to listen so closely to the experience at the pastoral level of each person. And Tia, you had talked about the Augustinian spirituality as really grappling with the restlessness in our hearts. That's, I'll admit, the only thing I know about Augustinian spirituality, the only quote I know from St. Augustine. And I'm curious if you see continuity there, thinking about Emily's question around deep desires and restlessness, and what that from a synodal approach might offer the church on this question of inclusion and orthodoxy. I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that.
Um, I can start. That's a okay. So so there your question, Lucas, is probably about 4 or 5 questions. So let's let's kind of jump in. So in terms of kind of continuity between the Jesuit spirituality and the Augustinian spirituality, and how we see this in these two back-to-back papacies that we have. There are I won't say that there are continuities within. 'Cause I work at Villanova, and I want to stay that way. Um, so, what I will say, here's the thing. So we saw from that first speech on the balcony that uh, Leo said, a church that is synodal. So we know that going into it. And Lucas, you mentioned, listening and his work, his 2 terms as prior general and traveling the world and listening to people on the ground and letting that bubble up. But then we can connect that also to the name that he's chosen. In choosing the name Leo, he's telling us the importance of Catholic social teaching, uh, which is the church's social doctrine, into his papacy. And that's really that listening, that being on the ground with the people, close to the people, that is very Augustinian. But then it's also subsidiarity. It's also, a hallmark of Catholic social teaching. And then, as you said, letting that bubble up and see how that impacts the overall structure of the church. So there's much to look at, and many dots that we can connect here. And that being said, this is, as we know, as Tricia talked about, and as we know that he was there as Cardinal Prevost. He was there, in the chamber during the synod on synodality. So this is something that is very close to him, and he has told us from those opening moments of his papacy that this is something that he's going to be focused on, and we know from his many years in Peru as a missionary and as the Bishop of Chiclayo, that being close to the people, being amongst the people, is something that is very important to him, and something that he has a long track record of.
Very briefly, and then I would love for Lucas to answer the other. I think I've already heard Leo reference imperfection and just his attempt to get it right. And I think when we look back at Pope Francis, there's a temptation to look at this larger than life figure who we see as this global figure, but also made mistakes too. Just to reference too, he used a slur against a gay community as an Italian word that was a very derogatory term. There is a really fun little update to that Father Jim, whom we mentioned earlier, actually kind of gave him a little correction on that and said, "Hey, do you realize what this means?" And then Pope Francis subsequently said, "Thank you for that conversation." So I think as we look ahead, I think it's important to sort of right size the larger than lifeness with the imperfection. And yes, Leo's going to bring that thoughtfulness, but he may not always get it right. So it'll be interesting to see. Leo or Lucas, there's some great questions directed to you in here.
Yes, I see them in the chat. First, we have from Brad Vermeulen, who is the lead author on the study that I am citing, and I'm grateful for your really good work. It's been really great. So the first question is around trajectory of the priesthood, and Brad is saying we know that we know that the priesthood is getting more conservative on topics of sexuality, and that more recently ordained priests are less likely to support Francis. And I just wanted to build on that and say, to put up a slide for a moment from a previous presentation, just very briefly on the left of the screen, you'll see that on the right is the same chart I showed you today, but on the left shows that similar by decade of ordination, priests who are more recently ordained, the chart or the priests on the right of the left box are less likely to approve of Pope Francis. We see the orange numbers and green number especially go down, approve somewhat go down very dramatically over time. So I just put that as to support Brad's comment. And Brad is asking, what do we think the trajectory? Where's the American Catholic Church headed in terms of its leadership, trending towards or away from inclusion? And that we can put in conversation with Paula McCabe's question, which is, are there differences between diocesan priests and those who are religious? To answer the second one first, the number of religious priests was relatively low in this sample. And while statistically significant in my own analysis, I argued it was really hard for us to know where they fall because they could be conservative priests from conservative diocese or not diocese, but conservative religious communities, and then they could be Jesuits or Franciscans, but they could be a conservative Franciscans as well. And so I wasn't really certain what to make with that statistical significance, and sort of while we know that religious priests tend to have longer formation, and then diocesan priests tend to live in community, which supports a certain maybe pastoral sensibility at home, and tend to have more pastoral opportunities throughout the formation than diocesan priests. That might explain the finding, but I'm not certain if it fully does. And perhaps a more concerted study of religious priests could give us an answer to Paula's question. To go back to Brad's question, I think that, and Brad, you know this from your own research, the research dating back to Andrew Greeley and others is showing this trend line that you find. You're using data from, or you're building on I believe it's the 2001 or 2002 LA Times study of Catholic priests, and your numbers are even more dramatic than the numbers from 2001, suggesting that there is a trend line towards increased conservatism. I think another study moving forward should look to see, in light of the tone we see with Leo, do we see a similar trajectory? Do we see maybe if we ask directly around synodal listening, what we might find? Anecdotally, and I can't say from a statistical standpoint, but anecdotally, my experience is that there is a chasm growing between religious and diocesan priests, especially those who are recently ordained. And that points to Tricia. You had named sort of some of the markers that you found in the transcripts we analyzed, that maybe give qualitative support to the quantitative findings from this study and from the previous one. So that'd be a way I'd answer that, but not certain in this last minute if any of you have anything else you'd like to add.
I really want to thank each one of you, Father Lucas Sharma, Doctors Tia, Noelle Pratt, and Dr. Tricia Bruce. I think it really, Ruth, I think it shows that this is a great opportunity for all of us to kind of showcase the awardees, and we learn a lot from their research, and we are looking forward to continue in the fall. I think the plan is to start with the winner of the book award. So please stay tuned, and we'll organize the webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us and for engaging. And this will be continued. Wishing everyone happy summer, safe summer, and we'll see you hopefully in October.
Yes, and I want to say thank you to Karen too for all of your great work. I meant to thank you as well, Karen, for everything you do as executive officer of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. So thank you to everyone today.
Absolutely. We cannot do it without Karen. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.